Harold had spent most of his life working long hours, saving every penny he could, always dreaming of a quiet place where he could escape the noise of the city. He had imagined a small house by a lake, a place where he could spend his mornings fishing and his evenings watching the sun sink behind the trees. After years of careful planning, he finally found a property that matched his dream. It wasn't fancy or big, but it was perfect in every way. The small lake at the back of the property was serene, the water clear, reflecting the sky and trees like a mirror. Birds would skim across the surface in the early morning, and occasionally a deer would come down to the water's edge to drink. For Harold, it was peace and freedom wrapped in one perfect package. The property sat right on the edge of a larger community governed by a homeowners association. The HOA was known for being strict, with rules about lawn care, paint colors, and fences. Most people who lived there followed the rules closely, and some even treated the HOA like a second government. Harold didn't mind that. He knew his land was technically outside the HOA boundaries, but he had neighbors who were polite and friendly. He had made sure to check the property lines carefully before buying, confirming that the lake was part of his land and not under the HOA's control. He felt confident that he had done everything right. For the first few months, Harold enjoyed a simple life by the lake. He would wake up early, make coffee, and sit on the small wooden dock listening to the sounds of water lapping against the shore. Fishing became a favorite pastime, not because he needed food, but because it allowed him to feel connected to the quiet rhythm of nature. He planted a small vegetable garden and tended to it with care. Everything felt right, like the way it was supposed to be. He felt safe and free, knowing this little corner of the world was his own. Then one morning, something unusual happened. Harold noticed a dark SUV parked on the road near the entrance to his property. It wasn't someone he recognized, and the way it sat there idle and quiet made him uneasy. He watched for a few minutes, but the car didn't move. Eventually it drove away, leaving him to shake his head and try to dismiss it. Maybe it was just someone lost or passing through, but the feeling didn't leave him. Something about the timing, the way it appeared without warning, made his instincts tingle. A week later, Harold received a letter in the mail that made his heart sink. It was from the HOA. The tone was aggressive, almost confrontational. The letter accused him of trespassing and using the lake illegally. According to the HOA, he was accessing property under the association's control without permission and could face fines or legal action. Harold read the letter several times, each time growing more frustrated and confused. He knew the lake was on his property. He had the deed, the surveys, and every document proving his ownership. Yet here was a formal accusation claiming he had no right to enjoy his own land. Harold felt a mix of disbelief and anger. He had followed the rules, checked the boundaries, and even spoken to neighbors before finalizing the purchase. How could an organization that didn't even own the land assume they could send threats to him? The letter demanded that he stop all activities near the lake immediately, or face consequences. Harold sat back in his chair, taking a deep breath. He knew that reacting angrily would only escalate things. He needed to stay calm, gather evidence, and plan his next steps carefully. His love for the lake hadn't diminished, but suddenly, what had been a peaceful retreat now felt under threat. Over the next few days, Harold tried to maintain his routine. He still went down to the lake in the early morning, still enjoyed the quiet and the fishing, but he kept an eye out for any suspicious activity. He noticed more cars occasionally driving slowly past his property, sometimes stopping to stare before moving on. It was subtle, almost like they were watching him, but it was enough to keep him on edge. He couldn't help but wonder if the HOA had started keeping tabs on him, waiting for any excuse to escalate their claims. One afternoon, while Harold was untangling fishing lines on the dock, he heard the crunch of tires on the gravel road. 2 police officers stepped out of their vehicle, looking serious and official. Harold greeted them politely, trying to hide his nervousness. The officers explained that they were there because the HOA had reported him for trespassing. They needed to verify the property lines and make sure he wasn't violating any rules. Harold nodded calmly, realizing that this was the moment where his preparation and knowledge of his property would be tested. He invited the officers to walk with him to the lake, pointing out the boundaries and explaining what he had purchased. He talked about the survey he had done, the legal descriptions in the deed, and even historical maps showing the property lines. The officers listened attentively, taking notes and occasionally asking questions. Harold kept his tone respectful and factual, understanding that losing his temper would not help. He wanted them to see that he was not trying to hide anything, that he was simply a property owner enjoying his land. As they walked, Harold thought about the irony of the situation. He had bought the land to escape bureaucracy, to find a place where rules and regulations wouldn't interfere with his peace. And now here he was explaining every inch of his property to law enforcement, because an organization assumed it could control something that wasn't theirs. He tried to focus on the beauty around him, the water shimmering in the afternoon sun, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, to keep his mind calm. The officers seemed impressed by his detailed knowledge and careful documentation, and Harold hoped that their professionalism would prevent the situation from turning hostile. When the visit ended, the officers assured him that they would report back to the HOA, but Harold could sense that the misunderstanding wasn't going to disappear overnight. He knew he needed to gather more evidence, organize his documents, and be ready for the next step. For Harold, this was not just about standing his ground. It was about protecting the peace and freedom he had worked so hard to earn. He felt a renewed determination to ensure that his retreat remained his own, that no organization or individual could infringe on the land he rightfully owned. That evening, Harold sat on the dock again, letting the calm of the lake wash over him. He watched the sunset, painting the water in shades of orange and gold. Despite the tension, he felt a quiet satisfaction. He had faced the first challenge with patience and knowledge, and he knew that he could face more if necessary. His dream of living by the lake hadn't been stolen. It had been tested, and he was ready to defend it. The lake, the quiet, and the freedom he had bought with years of work were worth standing up for, no matter how long or difficult the battle might become. The next morning, Harold woke up early as he always did, but his mind was buzzing with thoughts about what had happened the day before. The visit from the police officers had been calm, but it reminded him that the HOA was serious about their claims. He had a deed and surveys, but he knew that documents alone sometimes weren't enough to stop an organization determined to make trouble. Harold decided that he needed to be proactive, not reactive. Today he would gather all his records and make a plan to ensure that there would be no question about his ownership. Harold started by going through his files. He had stacks of papers, the deed, old surveys, property maps, and even some letters from the previous owners. Each document was carefully labeled and dated. He made copies of everything, thinking ahead in case he needed to present them to the HOA, the police, or even a lawyer. As he went through the papers, he remembered the process of buying the land. He had spent weeks making sure the boundaries were clear, confirming that the lake was included and checking local records. Now all of that careful work was going to pay off. After organizing the documents, Harold decided to take a walk around the property. He wanted to make sure that the boundaries were clearly marked and that there was no room for confusion. He walked slowly, noting where the trees grew and where the fence lines of nearby HOA properties started. The lake stretched calmly behind him, shimmering in the morning sun. He paused at the water's edge, listening to the gentle lapping of the waves. For a moment, he allowed himself to breathe and forget about the confrontation. This was his land, and he intended to enjoy it. Later in the afternoon, Harold decided to take a more direct approach. He called a local property attorney he had used in the past. The attorney listened carefully as Harold explained the situation, including the letter from the HOA and the police visit. The attorney reassured Harold that the deed was clear and that the lake was unquestionably part of his property. He also advised Harold to maintain a calm and professional approach. "Documentation and patience will win," the attorney said. "Don't let them provoke you into a fight you don't need." Harold felt a sense of relief. Knowing that he had legal support gave him confidence that he could handle whatever the HOA tried next. That evening, Harold returned to the lake with his files in hand. He sat on the dock, spreading out the papers on a small table he had set up, and began reviewing each one. He wanted to make sure he could explain everything clearly if anyone challenged him again. He studied the surveys, noting the exact measurements and boundaries. He read through the deed, highlighting the sections that specifically mentioned the lake. He even included some historical maps showing the lake had been privately owned for decades before the HOA was created. As he went through the documents, Harold realized how thorough he had been when purchasing the property. All he needed now was to present it calmly and confidently to anyone who questioned him. The next day, Harold noticed movement near the edge of his property. Two people he recognized from the HOA were walking along the boundary, looking around with what seemed like curiosity and suspicion. Harold stayed calm and waved politely. He knew that reacting aggressively would only make things worse. Instead, he decided that it was time to formally invite the HOA representatives to see the records. If they came with a neutral mindset and the right documents, there would be no question about his ownership. Harold wrote a short, respectful letter inviting the HOA board members to meet him at the lake. He explained that he wanted to clarify any misunderstandings and that he had all the proper documentation to show that the lake was part of his property. He kept the tone polite but firm, avoiding any words that might escalate the situation. Then he delivered the letter in person to the HOA office. The staff received it politely, but Harold could sense a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. Some of the board members might not have expected him to respond so calmly and professionally. While waiting for a response, Harold continued his daily routine. He fished, tended to his garden, and walked the property, all while keeping an eye out for any unusual activity. He noticed that some neighbors had begun watching the situation with interest. A few even came over to greet him, asking about the letters and the police visit. Harold explained the situation briefly, emphasizing that he was simply protecting his property and trying to resolve the misunderstanding peacefully. His neighbors admired his calm approach and offered support, which gave Harold a sense of reassurance. He wasn't alone in wanting to see the situation handled fairly. A few days later, the HOA board responded. They agreed to meet at the property to review the documents and discuss the claims. Harold felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. He had prepared thoroughly, but he knew that facing the board could be tense. On the day of the meeting, he laid out all the documents on a small table near the dock, making sure everything was easy to see. As the board members arrived, Harold greeted them warmly and invited them to walk the property with him first. He showed them the boundaries, the trees, the fence lines, and finally, the lake itself. The members listened and took notes, some nodding as he spoke. Harold explained the deed, highlighting the sections that mentioned the lake and showed the surveys that confirmed its inclusion. He also mentioned the historical maps, which clearly established the lake as private property long before the HOA existed. The board members seemed surprised. Some had assumed the lake was part of the community because it was close to the HOA land, but Harold's documentation left no room for doubt. He stayed calm and professional, answering questions politely and showing them each piece of evidence in a clear, logical way. One member even admitted quietly that they had never looked at the legal records before making claims. Harold didn't gloat or respond with anger. He simply presented the facts, allowing the documentation to speak for itself. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Harold's ownership was undisputed. The board members thanked him for his time and promised to review the situation internally. Harold felt a sense of accomplishment and relief. He had faced the confrontation without anger, relied on careful preparation, and allowed the facts to prevail. The lake, which had once felt threatened by letters and police visits, now felt secure. Harold returned to the dock, sitting quietly and watching the water. The reflection of the sky and trees on the surface seemed even more beautiful now, a reminder of what he had worked for and what he had successfully protected. Over the next few weeks, Harold maintained his routine but kept a watchful eye on any HOA activity. He occasionally received emails from the board, acknowledging the ownership of the lake and assuring him that no further complaints would be made. Harold responded politely, thanking them for their professionalism. Slowly, the tension began to fade and life returned to its peaceful rhythm. Harold spent his mornings fishing and his evenings watching the sunsets, feeling a deep satisfaction. He had faced an unexpected challenge, handled it with patience and preparation, and protected the land he loved. The lake, the quiet, and the freedom it represented were now safe, a testament to careful planning, calm persistence, and the importance of standing up for what is right. After the meeting with the HOA board, Harold felt a sense of relief, but he knew the situation wasn't fully resolved. While the board had acknowledged the documents and the boundaries, he realized that organizations like this often find ways to continue disputes if they believe they can gain an advantage. He needed to make sure that his ownership of the lake was completely secure and that no future claims could cause trouble. With that in mind, he spent the next few days gathering even more supporting evidence, determined to leave no room for doubt. Harold began by researching public records, historical maps, and old property transfers. He visited the local county office, carefully reviewing documents that dated back decades. The lake had been part of a larger property that was subdivided many years ago, and every record he found confirmed that the land he owned included the lake. He photocopied every relevant document and added notes about dates and references. Each piece of evidence built a stronger case, and Harold felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that he had anticipated potential conflicts and prepared accordingly. Once his research was complete, Harold organized all the documents neatly. He created binders with tabs for each category: deeds, surveys, maps, historical records, and correspondence with the HOA. He even made a digital backup so he could present the information quickly if needed. Harold believed in being prepared, not aggressive. He wasn't looking for a fight. He simply wanted to protect what was rightfully his. Knowing that he could show clear proof of ownership gave him confidence and a sense of control. One afternoon, as Harold sat by the lake reviewing his binders, he noticed some of the HOA board members approaching again. This time they came with a representative who appeared to be a legal advisor. Harold greeted them politely, inviting them to sit on the small dock where he had laid out some documents. The board members seemed cautious, perhaps surprised by how well prepared Harold was. He explained that he wanted to review everything with them, to make sure there were no misunderstandings and that the boundaries of his property were clear. His tone was calm, friendly, and professional. Harold showed them each document carefully, starting with the deed and survey maps. He explained how the boundaries were measured and how the lake had always been included in his property. The legal advisor asked some technical questions which Harold answered confidently. He showed historical records that proved the lake had been privately owned long before the HOA had been formed. One of the board members asked if there could be any errors in the old surveys. Harold calmly explained that all surveys were verified and that multiple sources confirmed the boundaries. Each question from the board only gave Harold an opportunity to present more evidence, further solidifying his position. During the discussion, the legal advisor seemed impressed by Harold's thoroughness. He commented that many property disputes could have been avoided if both parties had maintained records like these. Harold remained patient and respectful, understanding that his demeanor mattered as much as the documents themselves. The board members, realizing that Harold was both knowledgeable and reasonable, began to change their tone. They asked fewer confrontational questions and started listening more carefully. Harold's strategy of calm persistence and clear evidence was working. After a long review, the HOA board members admitted that the documents left no room for dispute. Harold had been right all along. The lake was unquestionably his property. They agreed to make a formal acknowledgement in writing and promised not to interfere with his access or activities near the lake. Harold accepted the acknowledgement graciously, emphasizing that his goal had always been peaceful enjoyment of his land, not confrontation. The board members left with a clear understanding, and Harold finally felt that the tension had lifted. Even with the acknowledgement, Harold didn't become complacent. He continued to maintain detailed records of all correspondence and visits. He knew that people sometimes acted based on assumptions rather than facts, and he wanted to be ready for any potential misunderstandings in the future. He also began to make small improvements to the property, planting trees and creating a path along the lake's edge. These were small touches to enhance the land he loved and enjoyed, but they also reinforced his presence and ownership. Neighbors who had followed the situation closely began to show more interest in Harold's property. Some asked questions about the dispute and how he had handled it. Harold shared his experience with them, emphasizing the importance of preparation, patience, and clear documentation. People were impressed by his calm approach and the way he had relied on facts rather than anger. Harold's story became an example in the community of how to deal with misunderstandings and disputes without escalating conflict. Over the following weeks, Harold's life began to return to normal. He continued to enjoy the simple pleasures that had drawn him to the lake in the first place. He spent early mornings fishing, sometimes catching enough to share with neighbors. He watched birds and deer, and occasionally invited friends to join him for picnics by the water. The tension with the HOA faded into the background, replaced by a sense of security and contentment. Harold knew he had protected his property and that he could enjoy it freely. One evening, as the sun set over the lake, Harold reflected on everything that had happened. The confrontation had been stressful, but it had also been a lesson in preparation, patience, and persistence. He realized that staying calm, organizing evidence, and presenting facts clearly was more powerful than reacting with anger or frustration. The lake had been tested, and Harold had emerged not only as the rightful owner, but as someone who had handled a difficult situation with grace. Harold's story became known in the local community. People admired his approach and shared his experience with others who might face similar disputes. It was a reminder that understanding one's rights, staying calm, and relying on facts could prevent conflicts from escalating. Harold continued to live by the lake, enjoying the peace and freedom he had worked so hard to achieve. The water, the trees, and the quiet became symbols of his patience and determination. In the end, Harold's careful planning and calm persistence ensured that his dream of living by the lake remained intact. He knew that life could bring unexpected challenges, but he also knew that knowledge, preparation, and a steady approach were the keys to overcoming them. The lake, the tranquility, and the freedom he cherished were safe, and Harold could finally enjoy the retreat he had spent years imagining. Each morning, as he sat on the dock with a cup of coffee, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that he had faced the challenge with integrity and had secured his little paradise for the future. Even though Harold had the HOA's acknowledgement in writing, he didn't let himself relax completely. He had learned from the earlier confrontation that assumptions and misunderstandings could quickly escalate if not handled carefully. Harold spent the next days reviewing all correspondence, organizing his documents, and ensuring that every detail about his property and the lake was clearly recorded. He wanted a comprehensive record, not just for himself, but for anyone who might question his ownership in the future. Harold also continued to observe the HOA's activity from a distance. Occasionally, he would notice board members walking near the edge of his property or cars slowing down as if checking the area. He remained calm, understanding that vigilance didn't mean confrontation. Instead, he focused on reinforcing the boundaries of his land. Harold added small markers along the property lines, clearly showing where his land began and ended. These were subtle, respectful measures, not meant to provoke anyone but to make his ownership clear to anyone nearby. During this time, Harold's neighbors became increasingly curious. Some of them had witnessed the initial dispute with the HOA and were eager to hear how he handled it. Harold welcomed the questions and shared his experience. He explained the importance of staying calm, documenting everything, and presenting facts clearly. His story resonated with them, and soon Harold became an example in the community of how to deal with property disputes peacefully and effectively. People admired his patience and clarity, and a few even asked him for advice on handling their own small property issues. One morning, Harold noticed an unusual activity near the lake. A couple of board members from the HOA appeared, seemingly inspecting the area. Harold approached them calmly and asked if he could help. One of them hesitated and explained that they were checking on the boundaries, ensuring that nothing was being damaged. Harold invited them to sit and review the documents again if they wished. He laid out the deed, surveys, and historical records, showing them clearly that the lake was part of his property. The board members looked at the documents quietly, a mixture of surprise and respect in their expressions. Harold answered all their questions patiently, reinforcing the clarity of his ownership without raising his voice or becoming defensive. After the meeting, Harold felt satisfied that he had once again handled the situation with patience and professionalism. He knew that continued calm and transparency would discourage any future attempts by the HOA to challenge him. Over the following weeks, he focused on improving the property, planting trees, and creating a small path along the lake's edge. These projects were simple, but they strengthened his connection to the land and subtly emphasized his presence and ownership. Harold also began to document his daily activities at the lake. He took notes on visits, small repairs, and any interactions with neighbors or the HOA. While it seemed excessive at first, he understood the value of having a detailed record. Each entry reinforced his claim to the property and ensured that, if any misunderstanding arose, he could provide clear evidence of ownership and usage. His careful approach reflected the lessons he had learned from the initial dispute, showing that preparation and persistence were key to maintaining peace and security. The HOA eventually sent a formal letter acknowledging Harold's ownership once more. This time it was more professional and less confrontational, recognizing that their previous claims had been unfounded. Harold responded politely, thanking them for their acknowledgement and emphasizing his desire to maintain a positive and respectful relationship with the community. By keeping his tone courteous and factual, Harold continued to demonstrate that he was reasonable and focused on peaceful resolution, not conflict. With the immediate tension resolved, Harold returned to the routines that had drawn him to the lake. He spent mornings fishing, evenings kayaking, and afternoons tending to his garden. The lake, once a source of stress due to the HOA dispute, had returned to being a place of peace and enjoyment. Birds skimmed across the water, and occasional deer appeared at the shore. Harold felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that he had defended the land he loved without losing his calm or integrity. Neighbors continued to show interest in Harold's approach. Some asked how he had handled the dispute, and Harold shared his experience openly. He emphasized the importance of patience, thorough documentation, and maintaining a calm demeanor. People were impressed by how he had managed the situation without escalating conflict, and many felt inspired to adopt a similar approach if they faced property disputes in the future. Harold's story became a quiet lesson for the community about standing up for one's rights while maintaining respect and composure. As the weeks turned into months, Harold's connection to the lake grew even stronger. He added a few benches along the path he had created, making quiet spots to sit and enjoy the view. He planted wildflowers along the edges, attracting butterflies and other wildlife. Every improvement was a small celebration of the land he had fought to protect. The lake became more than just water and trees. It became a symbol of his perseverance, patience, and commitment to his dream. Even with everything resolved, Harold remained vigilant. He understood that ownership came with responsibility, and that misunderstandings could still arise. He continued to maintain detailed records of all property-related activities, ensuring that there was always clear evidence of his ownership. At the same time, he enjoyed the simple pleasures of lake life, finding balance between vigilance and relaxation. The water, the quiet, and the beauty of the surroundings provided a daily reminder of what he had achieved and what he had worked to protect. One evening, as Harold sat on the dock watching the sun dip below the horizon, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The dispute with the HOA had been challenging, stressful, and unexpected, but it had also taught him valuable lessons. He realized that preparation, patience, and professionalism could turn even tense situations into opportunities to assert rights without conflict. The lake had been tested, and Harold had met the challenge with integrity and calm. Now it was truly his sanctuary, a place where he could enjoy the fruits of years of work and careful planning. Harold's experience also strengthened his belief in community. While the HOA had been difficult, his neighbors had shown curiosity, support, and respect. Sharing his story and helping others navigate small disputes had created connections and a sense of shared understanding. Harold's calm and thoughtful approach had not only protected his land, but had also inspired others to handle conflicts with dignity and care. The lake, once a source of tension, had become a center of learning and inspiration for those around him. In the end, Harold found a deeper sense of peace than he had ever imagined. The lake, the trees, the wildlife, and the quiet moments became symbols of his perseverance and careful planning. Each day at the dock reminded him of the value of staying calm, being prepared, and handling challenges with integrity. Harold had faced the HOA, protected his property, and found that patience and knowledge were far more powerful than anger or confrontation. His retreat was now secure, and he could fully embrace the freedom and tranquility that had drawn him to the lake in the first place.